Welcome, colleagues. Welcome, colleagues, to this webinar series for Latin America and the Caribbean on infant and young child feeding in emergencies. Thank you for connecting on time. We may wait a few seconds for participants to connect, so thank you for your patience. Next slide, please. So today's session will be held in English, but we have simultaneous translation into French. Just click the icon interpretation at the bottom of the screen. Chers participants, merci de vous être joints à nous. La session d'aujourd'hui sera présentée en anglais, mais nous avons un service de traduction simultanée en français. Donc, cliquez sur l'icône interprétation en bas de l'écran et choisissez la langue de votre préférence. Dans ce cas-ci, le français. Next slide, please. Okay, I will continue in English. So today we have a team of facilitators. Well, my name is Yvette Fauch. I'm a nutrition specialist. I work at the UNICEF Regional Office for Latin America and the Caribbean. We also have with us Patricia Dominguez, nutrition consultant at the same office, working with me. We also have Andrea Garcia, Senior Advisor for Emergency Nutrition at Save the Children. And we are receiving the technical support from Sanya Segvich, so Program Officer, Technical Support Team from the Global Nutrition Cluster Technical Alliance. Next slide, please. So the Global Nutrition Cluster Technical Alliance, known as the Alliance, is an initiative established to improve the quality of nutrition in emergency preparedness, response, and recovery by enabling and providing coordinated, accessible, and timely technical support through multiple channels. So you can see here the different partners working at the Alliance, as well as the supporting donors. Next slide, please. Okay, so the objectives of this webinar series is to strengthen the technical knowledge and capacities on infant and young child feeding in emergencies of organizations involved in responding to emergencies in Latin America and the Caribbean. Our target audience is government institutions, NGOs, UN agencies, and emergency coordination platforms, among others. And we are using a format composed by why, what, and how. So the why explains the rationale of interventions and practices that are being promoted in emergencies. The what goes a bit in depth regarding the interventions and practices that should be promoted in emergencies. And the how explains the steps to take during an emergency. So we'll talk about emergency response, but also we'll touch on some elements on preparedness. Next slide, please. So today is the second of three webinars. Today we'll be discussing on how to support infants who cannot be breastfed in emergencies. Last week we discussed on how to support children who can be breastfed, so breastfeeding support in emergencies. And next week we'll present on supporting complementary feeding in emergencies, so focusing on children older than 6 months with the introduction of food. But today we'll be supporting infants who cannot be breastfed. Next slide, please. Okay, an infant during the feeding in the first 2 years of life. So from birth to until 2 years and also beyond, breast milk is the ideal food. I mean, it's safe, clean, it contains antibodies which help protect against many common childhood illnesses. Then when children cannot be breastfed, specifically infants younger than 1 year, feeding with breast milk substitutes is needed. However, it's only needed following an individual assessment to ensure that this is the right approach for this child. This is key in emergencies. And after 6 months, children need to be fed with appropriate complementary foods and while using appropriate feeding practices. Next slide, please. So here is a summary of infant and young child feeding support. So with the different steps from early initiation of breastfeeding through exclusive breastfeeding, and then the introduction of complementary foods with the key elements to be taken into account. So minimum meal frequency, dietary diversity, and of course breastfeeding to be continued during these 2 years, but also beyond. So the manual you're seeing here, the yellow one, is the operational guidance for infant and young child feeding in emergency. So it's a key publication for this specific topic. And we invite you to have a look at this manual. And infant and young child feeding in emergencies aims to ensure 2 fundamental humanitarian principles. The first one is to do no harm. The second, save lives, while at the same time preventing malnutrition. Next slide, please. Okay, now I'm handing over to Andrea Garcia to do the pretest. Over to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Yvette. Well, now we are going to start with the pretest. You are going to see a new window in your screen. So please select the correct answer in this new screen. While you answer, I will be reading the questions and waiting for you to answer. Please, this is confidential. We are here to learn, so don't be afraid to answer wrong, because that's why we are here, because we are all learning. The first question we have is, for planning programming to support infants who cannot be breastfed, and we have 4 options. The first one, stocks of breast milk substitutes should be kept ready for any emergency. Option B, identify local BMS suppliers to purchase locally. Option C, the logistics team should be left to deal with the BMS supply proposal. Or D, a statement should be prepared to request the donations of BMS. And don't be shy. Remember, this is confidential. We don't know who is answering what. Well, then the second question, during emergency situations, all non-breastfed infants, option A, should initiate relaxation immediately. Option B, should receive donated human milk immediately. Option C, should receive an individual assessment to establish the type of support needed. Or option D, they should receive breast milk substitutes immediately. Okay, we have now more people answering. It's confidential, remember. Don't be shy. And number 3, during emergency situations, option A, donations may be accepted for infants who are not breastfeeding. Option B, the risks of using BMS should be minimized with appropriate programming. Option C, the marketing code should be adhered to and the purchase of breast milk substitutes should be avoided. Or D, under no circumstances the purchase and distribution of breast milk substitutes should be considered. Okay, now here we have some participants are answering. Remember, it's confidential. It doesn't matter if you answer in the wrong way. We are here to learn, and we are going to have the chance to answer these exactly same questions at the end. So we are going to be able then to answer correct if we don't have it right now. Well, we have 1 more minute to answer. Choose the option you feel or you think that it's the correct answer. And after the presentation, we are going to check them again, and you will have the chance to review or correct. And also remember, it is confidential, so we don't know who is answering what. So don't worry, don't be shy. We're here to learn. So Sania, I think that we can close it now. We have the 68% of participation. So I am going to give the word again to Yvette. Next slide, please.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Okay, so the next part we're going to present is why supporting infants who cannot be breastfed is needed in emergencies. Next slide, please. So the first important element to take into account is that non-breastfed infants are at higher risk of mortality. Here we're seeing some figures on infants younger than 6 months of age living in low and middle income countries. When they receive no breastfeed at all, they are 14.4% times more likely to die when compared to their peers who were exclusively breastfed. Then we see that when breast milk is introduced, this risk decreases. So just for you to show, only for me to show you that without breast milk, these children are at high risk of mortality. Next slide, please. Here, well, we also see a bit of the same. So non-breastfed infants are at higher risk of infection and therefore mortality. So they are 5 times more likely to die from pneumonia and 10 times more likely to die from diarrhea. So the message here is that breast milk is more than just food. It's a powerful medicine that protects against disease and is tailored to the needs of each child. Next slide, please. Okay, so what do we see in emergencies? So the previous 2 slides were presented in context, in non-emergency contexts. So in emergency contexts, things get more complicated. So we see that actually breastfeeding is threatened, is at risk of different types of emergencies. For example, displacement or hurricanes, earthquakes. Next slide, please. Let's have a closer look of how this happens. So in emergencies, we see populations being displaced, basic services being interrupted. So we see the loss of livelihoods and crops. In emergencies, there's limited access to food, limited access to health services, to hygiene and sanitation conditions that are affected. There's limited access to water, there's a loss of income, and there's disruption of health, nutrition, and of course, feeding practices. So these compromise the dietary intake of young children, but also contributes to the increased risk of diarrhea and infectious diseases, leading to malnutrition and maybe even death. Next slide, please. And well, the younger the child, the greater the risk. So babies and young children have very specific nutritional needs, and they are born with an underdeveloped immune system. So in humanitarian context, this population group can account for a large percentage of deaths. Actually, we see in the literature, the published total mortality rates for children under 1 year of age in emergencies can reach up to 53%. So just to say that children under 1 are extremely vulnerable, children under 6 months are even more vulnerable. And this is the age group that needs most breast milk, that sometimes is not possible. And these are the ones who would need replacement feeding in emergencies. Next slide, please. Here, we have another graph showing how infants under 6 months face a higher risk of mortality. So these are deaths as percentage of admissions in a therapeutic feeding program in Afghanistan. And we can see that the higher percentage of death is seen among the infants younger than 6 months of age. So this is a key population group to take into account, to identify during emergencies, as these will be the ones who will need most our support. Next slide, please. So let's also talk a bit about the challenges breastfeeding mothers face in emergencies. So we often found a misconception that stress or a lack of food affects the milk supply. Actually, mothers face a lot of stress, a lot of changes. They may have lost their families, their homes. So of course, breastfeeding can be very difficult at these times. But stress or emergencies do not affect production of breast milk. It can momentarily affect the release, but not the production. And these mothers need support. They need to be reassured on their capacity to breastfeed. However, what we see in emergencies is that there is a lack of breastfeeding support, and this is where we can all contribute. Also, a big challenge is that donations of infant formula and powder milk are made massively, and this of course threatens breastfeeding. We're going to see that a bit more in depth in a couple of slides. And there's also a general lack of knowledge about the risk of using breast milk substitutes in emergency situations. So we're going to see also in a couple of minutes. Next slide, please. So artificial feeding is extremely risky in emergencies. In emergencies, there's a lack of water for preparation and cleaning. There's improper cleaning of eating utensils, including baby bottle, is a source of infection. There's a limited supply of breast milk substitutes. There can be contamination of breast milk substitutes. For example, if these are partitioned in small little bags, as we have seen in other emergencies. So this is extremely dangerous. And breast milk substitutes do not contain antibodies. Next slide, please. Well, these products, breast milk substitutes, carry a higher risk with greater consequences in emergency settings. So again, there's reduced sanitation hygiene, save water, there's overcrowding, displacement. There's also increased caregiver stress and burden, a reduced ability to buy breast milk substitutes, in addition to other challenges. Next slide, please. So infant formula donations are extremely common in emergencies. Here we can see a picture of breast milk substitutes donations in a shelter in Mexico after the earthquake hit in 2017. So these were donations made by the population. So populations had a good intention. They bought these products for children, for feeding children, but without knowing all the risks that they carry. Next slide, please. Here we see a picture in the same emergency. Here we see massive donations of breast milk substitutes by a company, a breast milk substitutes company. And here the intention is different because there are, of course, commercial interests. They are entering a new market. The problem is that it's an extremely vulnerable market, so there are ethical concerns. And the problem here was that the government itself called for donations of breast milk substitutes in emergencies. So there's a very general lack of knowledge about the risks of breast milk substitutes in emergencies. Next slide, please. So this is a summary in every emergencies. These products are unsafe. Sometimes they are expired. or close to be expired, the ones that are donated by companies, for example. They can also be the wrong type, such as more suitable for toddlers, and the quality can be unreliable. They can be labeled in the wrong language, for example, English, but if we are in Haiti, when we speak French or Creole, having the labeling in English is not very useful. Then the wrong quantity can be used. There's also inconsistent supply. So if all these products finish, then there's no more to continue feeding these children. Well, there are many other challenges that are listed here, but the key message is that donations and uncontrolled distributions undermine the health of all infants in all emergencies. Next slide, please. Here are a few images to show that more visually. So breast milk substitutes are often distributed to breastfeeding mothers, again, sending a negative message about breastfeeding, undermining mothers' confidence and interrupting breastfeeding. As we have seen, breastfeeding is life-saving in emergencies. Next slide, please. Now the code. So the code is an international health policy framework set up to regulate the marketing of breast milk substitutes in order to protect breastfeeding. And the code applies also in emergency situations. It is especially important. There's also often a lack of understanding around the application of the code in emergency situations. So it's important to point out that the code is intended to protect breastfeeding infants by ensuring breast milk substitutes will not be distributed in an untargeted way or based on inaccurate or biased information. Is intended to protect artificially fed infants by ensuring breast milk substitutes will be used as safely as possible. And the code does not restrict the availability of breast milk substitutes, but it restricts the marketing and promotion. And this includes promotion in the form of humanitarian donations. So it does not prohibit its use by non-breastfed infants during emergencies, but the way in which they are procured and targeted for distribution. Next slide, please. Okay, so despite all this, there will be infants who are not breastfed or who are partially breastfed and that they need support. They need support because they are highly vulnerable, so they require urgent identification and targeted protection and support, given the increased risk of morbidity and mortality. And so they will need breast milk substitutes, but we need to provide them in a safe way. Next slide, please. Okay, now I'm handing over to Andrea for the next part, how to support infants who cannot be breastfed in emergencies. Andrea, over to you.
Thank you, Yvette. Next slide, please. Okay, to start with this section, we are going to check this decision tree that helps us when we are evaluating a mother and the child. In the last session, we reviewed this first part of the top when a baby is breastfeeding, and we take the decision of keep encouraging this breastfeeding practice or evaluating the feeding difficulties that they may have and offer support to them to overcome. And now in this session, we are going to explore the way where an infant is not breastfed by his or her mother. We are going to quickly explore in priority order the viability of first relaxation, then wet nursing, and also the donor human milk. All these evaluations should be informed by cultural context, current acceptability to mothers, and also the availability of this service. If these options are not acceptable to mothers, caregivers, or they are not feasible to deliver, then we will have to enable the access to a short supply of an appropriate BMS or breast milk substitute, accompanied by an essential package of support. I am going to start talking about the first step that we would explore, that is going to be relaxation. Next slide, please. Well, we have here our operative guidance of the infant feeding in emergency group, and we can find here the definition, the information that they give us about relaxation. And they tell to us that a non-breastfeeding mother who wishes to relactate will require skilled breastfeeding support until the breastfeeding is reestablished. The success of the relactation will depend on the mother's well-being, and important to say, the motivation. This mother wants the relactation process. It is not something that we are going to tell her to do. So it's her motivated. We also have to consider the age of the infant and how long the mother has ceased breastfeeding. Also is important, as I mentioned before, the skilled support. An important note is also that infants less than 6 months will benefit the most of this relactation process. Next slide, please. And well, we have here the definition of relactation. The relactation, you should know that is a procedure by which a mother manages to recover her milk production after it has totally or partially decreased. Why this may happen? Well, we have like lots of possibilities, but many infants discontinue breastfeeding in the first weeks or months as a result of illness or as a result of unsolved breastfeeding difficulties. And this, of course, may carry more risk of illness, malnutrition, and death. And we also have here the definition of the induced lactation. This means that the milk production process without the woman having been pregnant is possible. And this is important because we are going to may explore this way in the next section when we talk about wet nursing. Important to remind, a woman who has stopped breastfeeding her child recently or in the past can resume producing milk for her own or an adopted child, even without a pregnancy. Next slide, please. Here we have the reasons for relactation or the induced lactation. Important here is the first point is because the mother wants and she may need it in the emergency settings. We have heard some examples where mothers want to relactate their babies because they understand that they are at a higher risk in the emergency settings. We also may start this process because we had poor management of sick infants at the beginning of the breastfeeding process, or when an infant has a lower weight or other feeding problems, or that for any reason they have been separated, mother and infant. Again, emergency situations, that is the topic that we are talking specifically today. And also here we have when a woman cannot breastfeed her child. And please keep this in mind because we are going to talk about wet nursing in the next slides. Next slide now, please. Well, and now here we have one way we can use to increase milk production, that is the skin-to-skin contact. This practice, as you may know, is when the baby is placed directly on the mother's bare chest. And although it's a more common process after delivery, it can also still be practiced anytime the baby needs comfort, and the advantage is that it can help us to increase the mother's milk production. Next slide, please. We can also and should stimulate the breast through suckling of the baby while he or she is receiving donated breast milk or an appropriate BMS. Here in these pictures, you can see the drip drop method with a spoon. We also have this drip drop method with a syringe, and the supplemental suckling associated with a nasogastric tube. If we are considering this last option in emergency settings, we must be sure that we can have all the hygiene measures that involves the use of this material. If we do not have the conditions to offer hygiene, then we should not use this way and start exploring the others. Next slide, please. We can also explore other options. Here we have the lactation massage. This is a good example of a low-cost, low-tech intervention which can be used to support this relaxation process. Always, always, always with an appropriate counseling. Next slide, please. And here we have a summary from this resource that you are going to have. Here we have the essential measures that we have mentioned, that is counseling, breast stimulation, and the temporary milk supplementation. Next slide, please. And here we want to show you that this relaxation process is not going to happen in one day. There is evidence that tells us that it is a variable process, and the milk can just appear between 2 or 6 days, and it may seem to be related with the time that the mother has stopped breastfeeding. So the conclusion here, or the point, is that it is a process, and that's why we need to do counseling and give support to this mother and baby a long time. It is not just one time counseling. Next slide, please. Then we're going to talk now about wet nursing. Next slide, please. The wet nursing basically means when when a woman breastfeeds someone else's baby. Our operative guidance tells us that we should first of all investigate the cultural acceptability of wet nursing and the availability of wet nurses in preparedness and as part of early needs assessment. Next slide, please. There is not much evidence on wet nursing. The infant feeding in emergency core group is working with UNICEF in some documents, in some guidance, but we do have examples from other parts of the world. Here we have the example from Bangladesh. They evaluate, and it was appropriate to use this wet nursing possibility, and they establish these criteria to be able to participate as a wet nurse. And for example, here we have willing to wet nurse the infant until they are at least 6 months. Also, it would be ideal that a family, that this person is a family member or has a close relationship with this family, that of course lives in close proximity to the infant's household. Also, her own child should be healthy, gain weight well, and free from infections, no illness at all. And of course, it has to be accepted by the family of the wet nurse and the family of the infant. Next slide, please. And here we have something related with the wet nursing, because in some places, people must be afraid of the transmission of HIV. We know that the use of wet nurses in emergencies can save lives by providing an immediate source of breast milk for infants. And yes, it may carry a little small risk of HIV transmission, but it will always be helpful than not giving anything, or avoiding these babies to receive the nutrients and the protection that they can obtain from breast milk. Just a little guidance on HIV is that mothers and breastfeeding women living with HIV should exclusively breastfeed their infants for the first 6 months of life. Then they have to introduce the complementary foods, and the breast milk should be continued for 12 or up to 24 months, while always being fully supported for the antiretroviral adherence. Breastfeeding should then only stop once a nutritionally adequate and safe diet without milk can be provided. And this is important, can be provided. And we also have that when there are no antiretrovirals available, breastfeeding may still provide infants born to mothers living with HIV with a greater chance of HIV-free survival. Next slide, please. And my last point, next slide, please, is the donor human milk. The WHO tells us that when there is no breast milk available, we should use pasteurized human donor milk as the first alternative. In our operational guidance, we see that we do not have a lot of experience using formal or informal donor human milk in emergency settings. But what we know is that this option is more viable where there are existing human milk banks in emergency affected area. Next slide, please. We have here the definition of the donated human milk. It's expressed breast milk provided voluntarily by a lactating woman to feed a child other than her own. And it is usually obtained in a formal way through a human milk bank. The objective is feeding and protecting high-risk infants. Next slide, please. The human milk banks are services created to recruit breast milk donors, collect the donated milk, and then process, screen, store, and distribute it to meet the specific needs of infants for optimal health. As the operational guidance tells us, we in emergencies should identify breast milk banks in our countries, in your country, and try to establish these pathways that we may use when we need this kind of support. Next slide, please. You will here see that there are human milk banks in many countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. Next slide, please. And in this page, you can find your country and establish contacts for the preparedness phase of the emergencies. Next slide, please. I am going to now give the word to Yvette. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for that. So now we're going to the next session. What should we do to minimize the risk of artificial feeding in emergencies? Next slide, please. Okay, so let's have first a look at the terminology. What is artificial feeding? Artificial feeding means feeding with breast milk substitutes. And a breast milk substitute is any food, solid or liquid, that is marketed, otherwise represented or used as a partial or total replacement for breast milk, whether or not it is suitable for that purpose. Breast milk substitutes includes any milk that is marketed specifically for feeding infants from 0 to 3 years of age. And specifically, infant formula is a breast milk substitute industrially formulated in accordance with the applicable Codex Alimentarius standards for the purpose of satisfying the nutritional requirements of children 6 months of age, and which is adapted to their physiological characteristics. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's have a look at the indications for the use of breast milk substitutes. So this can be divided into two types of indications: temporary and then long-term. So temporary, breast milk substitutes can be used during relactation. So relactation, we have seen, can take some time. So there is a need to support the infants with breast milk substitutes. Also transitioning from mixed feeding to exclusive breastfeeding, when there is a short separation of the infant and the mother, and that when there's a short-term waiting period until wet nurse or donor human milk is available. So these are only temporary indications while breastfeeding is established. Longer-term indications include infants who were not breastfed before the crisis, or mother not wishing or who is unable to relactate, an infant who's established on replacement feeding in the context of HIV, an orphan infant, an infant whose mother is absent long-term, a specific infant, well, when there are medical conditions in the infant or the mother, if the mother is very ill, if the infant is rejected by the mother, or when the mother is a rape survivor not wishing to breastfeed. So the need for breast milk substitutes in humanitarian situation must be carefully assessed by skilled personnel, free from conflicts of interest, for example, by the industry, to really understand if breast milk substitutes are really needed and if it's only on a temporary basis or more long-term. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's have a look now at the actions or the interventions to take to minimize the risk of artificial feeding. So the first step is to prevent donations of breast milk substitutes. So to prevent the donations made by the public, but also by the companies, such as the ones we saw in Mexico in the previous slides. So it's important to issue an official statement with key messages for donors, local partners, and the media to discourage donations of infant formula and instead encourage financial contributions to support other urgent needs of the community. And focus also on the importance of breastfeeding and on supporting lactating women in emergencies. And this communication should ideally be prepared by the government that is coordinating the response, but it can also be done jointly. For example, the government with UN agencies or NGOs. The idea is to have different voices together to issue a strong message. And communication is critical in the first hours and days of responding to an emergency, because donations are really quick to arrive. So here is an example of statement issues in the response to the hurricanes Eta and Iota in Honduras in 2020. Next slide, please. The second intervention is to evaluate the need of breast milk substitutes for non-breastfed infants. So this is absolutely key. This is one of the most important interventions. We need to assess if the infants really need breast milk substitute, which type, and of course, if it's temporary or more long-term. So last week, we presented some evaluation forms. The first one is a simple rapid assessment. So this one should be used at the community level by different humanitarian partners. So every time they see a caregiver with a child under 2, they would need to complete this form. So the age of the baby, if the baby is being breastfed, if they have difficulties breastfeeding, if the infant is receiving infant formula, among other criteria. So I'm circling in red those that would be red flags, that maybe children or these infants would need support with breast milk substitutes. So these infants need to be referred to a full assessment by a qualified personnel. So really to understand more in depth their feeding practices, the different risks and the situation, to be able to determine the type of support they would need. Next slide, please. So here we see the flow chart presented already by Andrea. So it's for individual evaluation of the mother and the child. So now we're getting into the last point. So it's to recommend the use of breast milk substitutes. But we should take into account that this is recommended, but important criteria need to be taken into account. Next slide, please. So, okay. So now we need to procure, when we establish the need of breast milk substitutes in some infants, for example, as we saw, orphan infants. So it's important to procure breast milk substitutes and also utensils for preparation and feeding. The first step is to decide the quantity and also the type of breast milk substitute to purchase. So the first choice is ready-to-use infant formula. So it's a product, as it said, it's ready to use. It does not require any reconstitution, any preparation. So it's more expensive than powdered infant formula, but it is the safest option for the vulnerable groups, which is children under 6 months, and particularly in emergencies. So it's a sterile product until it's open. The second choice is powdered infant formula. It is a second choice because it is a non-sterile product, needs to be reconstituted with water. And if we don't have access to clean water, this can be a big challenge and of course a big risk. So again, there's risk related to unsafe preparations in emergency situations where conditions are often unhygienic, where safe preparation and use of infant formula cannot be assured. And these need to be procured for a shorter or longer period of time. But are you ready to use infant formula should be the preferred option. And there are also milks that are not recommended. It's not recommended to use concentrated liquids of infant formula because these need to be prepared, and there is a risk of errors in diluting the product. And of course, there's a higher risk of contamination once it is open. There are also therapeutic milks, F75 and F100, but these should be only used for the treatment for severe acute malnutrition cases with medical complications. And there are also special follow-up formulas for example, for toddlers or older children, but these are definitely not recommended. Next slide, please. So again, infant formula should never be, again, distributed to a population affected by an emergency without the needed resources. Now let's say we purchase powdered infant formula. Next slide, please. To be able to use powdered infant formula, we need to make sure that there is adequate support from skilled personnel, that information leaflets are distributed with the formula. There's possibility for hand washing. There's access to safe water. There are utensils for preparation, for example, measuring spoon, cup, a teaspoon, and also for feeding, such as small plastic cup or a glass. And then there's fuel to boil the water. So we see that it gets a bit more complicated, and it gets complicated to control all these elements in an emergency situation. Next slide, please. Now, we need to decide on the quantity of breast milk substitutes to purchase. So, and here we would divide the children in two groups. One is the infants younger than 6 months of age. Again, this is the most critical, the most vulnerable group of all. So the infant formula recommended is ready-to-use infant formula. So here we can see the quantities needed per day and also the forecast. So what we would need for a period of 6 months. And then also we can see the second option, powdered infant formula. So the average quantity we would need. And for this age group, so younger than 6 months, animal milk is not recommended due to significant nutritional inadequacy. So animal milk, such as cow milk, is not recommended for this age group. For older children, for children older than 6 months of age, so again, ready-to-use infant formula is recommended if it is available and affordable. Otherwise, ultra-high temperature, whole fat milk, such as cow, goat, sheep, should be used. Both options are safer than powdered infant formula. And just to say that ultra-high temperature is simply the milk that we're often using ourselves at home. Again, it's better than using formula in a powdered format. So this is, again, a bit of the amount. And well, infants and young children in this age group also need to receive safe and adequate complementary foods. So after 6 months of age, this is something we're gonna see next week, more in detail. Next slide, please. Now, a key message to take home today is that it's important to purchase breast milk substitutes and do not seek or accept donations. This is to ensure that the procurement and distribution of these products matches the needs in terms of the age groups and of course the quantities. Ensure that distribution of these products is done in line with international guidance that is targeted and with the appropriate support, so not distributed widely. To ensure the supply of a suitable type of amount of breast milk substitutes, so ensuring it is the one infants will need. And avoid infant formula and powdered milk are donated to breast milk mothers based on commercial interests. So this is very common in emergencies. This is why, again, it's not recommended to seek donations, but to purchase them. Also, when donations are made, they can be a lot of donations, and it's difficult to store them, let's say in a discreet way. So local purchase is suggested. Purchase in the same country the emergency is happening, although it may not always be possible. And any breast milk substitute donations that arrive should be placed under the control of the government or a designated agency, again, not distributed to the general population. Next slide, please. Here again are the utensils recommended for preparation. So cup, tool for measuring the amounts of water and powdered infant formula, in the case powdered infant formula is used, a spoon to mix the product and the water, fuel, and a pot to boil the water. And of course, feeding equipment, a small cup to feed that is easy to clean. And also bottle feeding is not recommended. If it is available or donated, ensure that space and facilities to clean them are available. But again, this is very difficult in emergencies. So a cup, a small cup or glass would be more suitable. Next slide, please. Another important element is where to store breast milk substitutes. So again, these should be discreetly stored out of the sight of the affected population to avoid these products to be interpreted as promotion of artificial feeding. We should follow the manufacturer's guidelines. They should be stored out of the direct sunlight in a secured and supervised area and at room temperature. Yeah, that is preferable. Next slide, please. Another important element is how to distribute breast milk substitutes. So there are two main options. The first one is to distribute them to families so that they prepare the formula and feed their children. So distribution, we should distribute that again. We should ensure that distribution is targeted following an assessment, that all efforts are made to prevent the promotion of these products. For example, if these products are distributed to mothers of infants or caregivers of infants who cannot be breastfed, maybe breastfeeding mothers will also like to receive a product. So this is why this should be done discreetly in a controlled space out of the sight of the affected population. It should be distributed in small amounts each time to the caregiver. That reduces also the chances of promotion of the product. It's important to track the distribution to individual children and also monitor and document the distribution in a detailed manner. So what is the age, the gender, the type of amount of breast milk substitutes, and the reason for provision of breast milk substitutes. Also, caregivers should be requested to return the empty containers to reduce the risk of breast milk substitute selling. That's also an important point. Next slide, please. An alternative option is the preparation of breast milk substitute by shelter staff, in case there are shelters established. So instead of breast milk substitutes distribution to individual caregivers or families. So this option is possible when safe preparation and use by families cannot be assured. So the considerations to take is that it's preferable to prepare powdered infant formula individually according to the needs, instead of large quantities, given that infant formula that remains at room temperature for long periods of time attract the growth of harmful bacteria. So this should be controlled. And it's important to prepare the feeds every time and administer them immediately. Again, bottles are not recommended. We need to make sure there's adequate space and facilities for cleaning. Next slide, please. Then an important element is to provide skilled individual support for preparation and counseling. So here are some guidance on safe preparation, storage, and handling on powdered infant formula. So again, it's important to have hand washing, save water, and spaces to basically to wash, but also to prepare the product. Next slide, please. Here we can see a picture of a label for hygienic preparation. That's also important to provide this information to the family. And this should also include a practical one-to-one demonstration. So for powdered infant formula, correct preparation should be assured. Feeds will require to be done according by age and weight, and the families will need counseling on how to feed with cup, highlighting also the risk of using bottles and tips. Next slide, please. So again, it's suggested to have individual counseling, so one-to-one education and demonstrations about safe preparation, and also how to feed, using also leaflets. And an important element we're going to see in a few minutes is the follow-up of individual children to monitor growth and overall health. Next slide, please. Safe storage is important as well. Responsive feeding as well, just as with breastfeeding. So it's really by understanding the cues of the infant. And yeah, of course, we need to ensure that caregivers also receive messaging on infant and young child feeding in emergencies in general, and where they can receive support services for that. Next slide, please. So when supporting a mother or a caregiver in individual counseling, as seen in this picture, we need to hold the baby sitting upright or semi-upright on your lap. Depending on the age, I mean, it may be a bit more difficult, and we need to wrap the baby to control a bit the movement. We need to hold the cup of milk resting on the lower lip so that the rim touches the baby's upper lip, and tip the cup so that the milk just reaches the baby's lip. It's really important, It's important not to pour the milk into the baby's mouth. It's really just to hold the cup to the baby's lips, and then let him or her take the milk. And we should measure the intake over 24 hours. So not just at each feed. Next slide, please. It's important to communicate as well at the community level, again, on the importance of breastfeeding, the associated risk of artificial feeding. So really to create an environment supportive of breastfeeding. And again, while we support infants who cannot be breastfed, that this is done in a controlled way with optimal hygiene practices. So this is still an important element. Next slide, please. We have also seen this in the last webinars. It's important to monitor the donation of breast milk substitutes. So the Global Nutrition Cluster made available this tool. So really to track the breaches to the code. So it's important to take that into account. And also to, not to share this widely, but to take this into account also for future emergencies. Next slide, please. It's also important to set up a tracking system for infants receiving breast milk substitutes to ensure they receive the required supplies. And again, to establish or strengthen systems for follow-up of all infants. So it's really important to ensure that their health and growth are going well. Next slide, please. I'm going to the end now. So a key aspect is to monitor and evaluate. It's more to document lessons learned. Sorry. So to document the experience. So what worked well, what didn't work. For example, here we see the challenges to the programmatic implementation of ready-to-use infant formula being documented, and this was done after the earthquake response in Haiti in 2010. Next slide, please. So this is all. I now give the floor to Patricia. Patty, over to you.
Okay, thanks Iveta and Andrea for your interesting presentation. The last topic today is the emergency response and preparedness measures. Next, please. Last week, we talked in detail about nutrition programming and emergency context. I will comment briefly on the general overview and the timeline. In an emergency context, time is critical. Every day without attention can have a human cost. Remember that an effective emergency response includes quick and high-quality intervention. You can see the 4 phases in the response and preparedness, and I will take a little about each one. Next, please. The actions to be taken as soon as possible include coordination and communication with the purpose to create a core working group, including all humanitarian actors working on nutrition, which define the key actions of the response to be effective. In the situation analysis and need assessment, the general purpose is to understand better the context, magnitude, and support required. Next, please. Within the first weeks, the response planning should be developed based on need assessment results. Here, we define the interventions that the nutrition sector could implement, which include competences, training, personnel, and resources. However, some specific needs to be taken to support non-breastfed children. We should identify the local suppliers to BMS and equipment, define a proper supply chain, and remember, it is not recommended a stockpile before BMS to onset an emergency. Since the response is implemented, MIE is a key part of any response in the emergency context. MIE is a tool that defines how the intervention strategy is going and the adjustment required to bring the best quality of support possible to the most vulnerable. During the response, we should ensure that the staff involved has sufficient capacity for assessment, supply chain management, and counseling, that manage a standard training package, and produce relevant training and communication materials about BMS use. Next, please. Here we can see recommended. Oh, okay. Next. As part of MIE, today we are sharing a heavy experience with BMS programming during the earthquake in 2010. The need assessment results show a complicated situation that includes bad breastfeeding practices, a high prevalence of HIV, and 20% of baby orphans and vulnerable before the earthquake. Next, please. The national cluster was activated by government. Based on the situation analysis, the nutrition response includes a BMS program. The safest option identified was ready-to-use infant formula, and the National Nutrition Cluster in Haiti, chaired by MOH and UNICEF, were responsible for acquisition, management, and administration of the RUF. Next, please. Okay. The key intervention established were points of counseling and nutrition for the baby or baby tents in 3 towns. The baby tents were safe spaces responsible to provide IYCF counseling and provide RUF in a controlled manner and under strict criteria for specific babies. Next, please. Additionally, to support breastfeeding, baby tents provide psychosocial support and detection of growth failure and acute malnutrition. A key action of the strategy intervention was the mandatory training based on national guidelines developed for all implementation partners of the BMS program. Next, please. During the individual evaluation, non-breastfed babies eligible were identified based on the admission criteria that you can see on the list, and the caregiver received counseling about the safety use of RUF and feeding with COOP. Next, please. The key lesson learned on the 80 experience was the administration of artificial feeding support must be based on clear protocol that contain admission and discharge criteria, standardized child record forms, and guidance on monitoring child growth, minimum program monitoring and evaluation, and standard training package, enough staff for attention, a strong logistic component for acquisition to disposal of waste, and regarding to attention, give the same priority to supporting lactating mothers and caregivers in the BMS component. If you want more information about this experience, we are going to share with you the reference. Thanks, and I give you the floor to Yvette.
Thank you very much, Patty. Next slide. Okay, so now we're heading to the end of the webinar. So we're showing here some of the resources we used for this webinar. So you can see here the Relaxation review of experiences and recommendations for practice. So these are from WHO. These are available in English, but also in French, as well as the infant and young child feeding in emergencies operational guidance, also available in both languages. Next slide, please. There are also other resources, such as a guidance note from Green Lab. Then another from the infant feeding in emergency group, and Save the Children with an infant feeding Infant and Young Child Feeding in Emergencies Toolkit. So we will provide the presentation at the end of the three webinars of the series, and we will also provide all the links to these resources. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to the questions and answers section. Andrea, over to you.
Thank you, Yvette. Well, here we have many interesting questions. We are going to try to answer a lot of them, but maybe not all. The first one is from Evelyn. It is clear that lactation takes some time. So what should we be feeding the baby on before lactation is fully established? Here the answer is going to be that, as you saw in the presentation, we have to make an evaluation, and our first option would be the donored human milk. While we start to establish this process of relactation, we should be feeding the baby with this donor human milk. And our second option, if we do not have this human milk, then it is going to be an appropriate breast milk substitute. I hope this answered this question. Then we have how. Well, sorry, I didn't ask my colleagues if you want to complement the answer with something else.
No, thank you, Andrea. I think your response was quite complete. I think, again, a key aspect we should not forget, because, I mean, is the evaluation of the needs. Because we can simply rush with breast milk substitutes and give it to the child, but it's really important to understand the type of need, and also if it will be temporary or more. Yeah, I mean, evaluation is key. This is only another point I wanted to highlight.
Thank you, Yvette. Then we have, how do we manage wet nursing in context of HIV? Do we test every day? And here I am going to start answering also. We have some guidelines from our operational guidance of the Infant Feeding in Emergency Core Group. And what they tell us is that we should be, of course, doing testing, but of course, it is not going to be possible every day. So we are going to do a lot of counseling in prevention of the transmission of HIV. And we are also going to make a risk assessment in the case that we cannot make this HIV testing. And they always remind us that we have to evaluate, assess every single case that we have, and of course that we have to take into account all the legislation in country. So it is not something that we as emergency teams go and build up. We have to consider every factor and then decide, trying to take the best option. Remember, always do no harm to these babies and these mothers. Yvette, do you want to say anything else, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Andrea. I think you mentioned all the elements. When you mentioned the importance of weighing the risks, it's key. We should just weigh these risks and take into account the probability of survival. Sometimes using, for example, powdered infant formula to avoid breastfeeding, to avoid the risk of HIV, can be more risky to the child. So in the context of an emergency with unhygienic environment and lack of access to clean water. So using the replacement feeding in this case can be more risky to the child than wet nursing, without having done the HIV test. So this is where we need to weigh the risk for survival.
Thank you very much, Yvette. Here we have another one. It says, does the wet nurse have to be breastfeeding? And I don't want to take it everything first, but Yvette, do you want to start and then I can complement, or do you want me to go first?
You can go first, and then I can complement.
Okay, thank you. Well, as we mentioned before, we do not have a guideline that tells us what needs to be happening. And I think that this question comes because we mentioned some criteria to become a wet nurse. Remember, this was just an example. And I would say with a general evaluation of the situation, it is not necessary that a wet nurse is breastfeeding. But if she is not breastfeeding, then she is not going to be able immediately to help us with this practice, because we would have to start with the induced breastfeeding. We have to start the process of stimulating the breast, the nipple, and other practices until we reestablish the production. And maybe that is going to take us a little time. So it is not a must, but it is going to help if this woman is already breastfeeding another baby, because we know that she can produce more milk in that specific moment. Yvette?
It's fine for me. No other comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I am going to read the last one because we have to continue with the agenda, but here we have another. Is the use of premixed feeds preferred in emergency situation rather than the powder formulas? I think Yvette can answer us.
Thank you, Andrea, and also thank you for the question. I'm not sure what premixed feeds are. I mean, if these are, ready to use, already packaged to be ready to use, so they are safe to be used, such as ready to use infant formula. So this should be considered. Again, powdered infant formula is very risky in the context of emergencies because of the unhygienic environment, the lack of access to clean water. So this is where we should weigh which of the options is safest in emergencies. And maybe if I can just reply a very quick question from June on the breast milk banks in the Caribbean. Indeed, I think there's in the list Andrea presented, there was no breast milk bank in the Caribbean, but maybe it's simply not in the list. However, I don't know if you're interested to set up a breast milk bank, there are also guidelines for that. That's all from my side. Over to you, Andrea.
Thank you very much, Yvette. I think we have a little more time, so I am going to read this other one. How can BMS secretly distributed without the other mothers knowing about it? Okay, this is an interesting question. We have some examples and some options. One way could be making this distribution through a pharmacy or a drugstore. After it is prescribed by a health member of the staff, then this person can go to this establishment. This is one way. It has not to be also a drugstore, but it can be like another local. Another strategy that we have heard is that these points must be far away from where mother and infants are concentrated. In this case, we can think about a safe space. We cannot make this distribution in the same space or really near. So the strategy would be to have this distribution point in other part of the refugee camp, or maybe the community, or the point is that it has to be far away from where everybody is concentrated. Yvette, do you want to complete?
Yes, thank you very much, Andrea. Also, again, very complete. In addition to that, yeah, I think it's important to have a closed space. So not to do it, in the open air. And this, in the closed space, this is where we also need to have a discrete storage. So not to be displayed to everyone. And then I am thinking about also the labeling. I think the labeling of the breast milk substitute should be also discrete, simply focusing on the safe preparation guidelines, and again without any promotional, let's say, messages on that. So that would also be part of the, let's say, secret or discrete distribution to mothers or caregivers.
Thank you very much, Yvette. As we have many questions, I am going to read another last one. And here we have, are there circumstances where the babies get used to BMS as relaxation process awaits? What can be done about it? Okay, this is a really interesting question. And what we have to remember here is that when we are doing the relaxation process, the idea is to offer just the first donor human milk, and then just if needed, the BMS, to provide the baby the food he or she needs. But the main point is that the baby is suckling the breast of the mother, because we are stimulating, that's what we want. So here the question may be related to someone thinking about the flavor of the BMS. And we have to remember that babies may want to prefer it, but what they may want the most is to be close to their mothers. So we, in this process, what we are trying to do is just to substitute the breast milk or the donor human milk for the milk that it is going to be being produced after this stimulation. So there is no like, what can we do to avoid this? The recommendation would be to follow the process of keeping the baby close to the mother's breast. Yvette, please, can you complement?
I think your response is quite complete, but I was looking at the list of the questions, and we have a question in French that maybe I can take.
Okay.
In emergency situations, isn't it important also to ensure a good nutrition of the mother, not only the child? And so this is a question from Armand. And of course, the mother's nutrition should be also taken into account. Specifically in this webinar, we were focusing on infants who could not be breastfed. But of course, maternal nutrition is key, and we would need a separate webinar to discuss specifically on that. Last year, we had a webinar on that, so we could also share the link to the recording on how to ensure good maternal nutrition. That's why I don't know if we have additional time or we should close the questions, Andrea. Over to you.
Thank you, Yvette. Yes, we have to end here the section of questions and answers, but we are going to collect all these questions that we were not able to answer, and we are going to compile them and answer them. You will receive, as Yvette reminds us before, the presentations, the recordings, and some questions and answers after the webinar series ends. So now we have to go to the next slide, please. And we are now in the post-test section. So please, you are going to see again the same window with 3 questions in your screen. Please help us selecting the correct answer. These questions are exactly the same that we answered at the beginning of the presentation. And well, you are going to maybe change the option that you choose at the beginning. That's okay, because maybe we learned something new today. So the first question is, for planning programming to support infants who cannot be breastfed, and our 4 options. Don't be shy. Remember, you have now all the knowledge to answer this. And we would really like you to answer. Until now, we only have 1. So please don't be shy. We are waiting for you. Our second question is, during emergency situations, all non-breast infants, and we have, should initiate lactation immediately, should receive donated human milk immediately, should receive an individual assessment to establish the type of support they need, or they should receive breast milk substitutes immediately. Okay, thank you. We can see now more answers here. And our third question is, during emergency situations, option A, donations may be accepted for infants who are not breastfeeding. B, the risks of using BMS should be minimized with appropriate programming. C, the marketing code should be adhered to, and the purchase of breast milk substitutes should be avoided. And D, under no circumstances, the purchase and distribution of breast milk substitutes should be considered. We have now 29% of participation. Thank you very much. I guess you are reading and trying to choose the best answer. I hope I am not distracting you a lot while I am speaking. We are now 43%. Don't be shy, don't be shy. Please help us. Sania mentioned us here in the chat. For us is very important. This helps us to know if we should make changes, for example, in how we present. Here we have. Okay. Someone is telling us that cannot answer this time. Well, thank you. Maybe next time. I wanted to say something. If someone cannot see this window with this post-test, maybe for the next time you can try to update your Zoom version, because this is like a new function, and maybe that's why some of you cannot see it for the next time. And we have 1 minute left. Okay. Sorry, I'm going to stop talking a little bit. We have half a minute. And as we are not receiving more answers, I think we can close. Thank you, Susania. And well, thank you all for your answers. Next slide, please. I am going to give the word to Yvette again.
Thank you very much, Andrea. So we're now going to go to the next steps and closing. Next slide, please. So we are going to kindly ask you to fill out a brief webinar evaluation. It will take less than 5 minutes, but it will be extremely important for us to understand how useful was this webinar for you, and any other recommendations you would have for us to improve future webinars. So the webinar evaluation will pop up when you close the webinar. Next slide, please. Now, if you look for support for in nutrition in emergencies, let's say you want to establish a program to support infants who cannot be breastfed in your country, so you can request support. And there are different options, different types of support. So if you want remote or in-country technical support, you can contact the Global Nutrition Cluster Technical Alliance. If you want to hire a consultant directly to support you in the process, the Global Nutrition Cluster Technical Alliance has a consultant roster. So there could be, you could select, or you could introduce different consultants from the rosters. If you want a quick technical advice, there's also the Global Nutrition Cluster Help Desk. And if you want peer support, You can also contact enn.net. And for anything, just please request support. Click on request support in the website of the Alliance. So here is a link that will be shared with you. So after the webinar series. Next slide, please. So this is all. Thank you very much for your attention today. So we had high participation. That is great. So we look forward for your participation next week at the same time, where we will be presenting how to support children from 6 months to 23 months. So the period of complementary feeding in emergencies. So thank you again and have a great day.